I work at Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and there are lots and lots of folks that also have contributed at FWC to this research and conservation. But then we have a huge number of partners who have assisted with all of the work from field work to funding to also captive breeding. So it's a really a success story for working with so many different types of partners and so many partners coming together for one little bird who I will introduce to you now. The Florida Grasshopper Sparrow is super cute, and I may be biased on that. It is still a sparrow, little drab brown bird. I'll go over the background of its life history a little bit and why perhaps the decline has been occurring and what that decline has looked like. And then I'll go over the myriad of conservation actions and research, some of them in the past and most of them are ongoing. And then look at the current population status and the future for this bird. So to give a little background on the Florida grasshopper sparrow, they are a small songbird. They are non-migratory, and they are a subspecies of the eastern grasshopper sparrow. So they're only found in Florida, and they prefer the Florida dry prairie. They are ground nesters, so they need a very particular type of ground cover in order to be able to nest and nest successfully. And their main reason for population decline has been habitat loss. They prefer dry prairie, and that dry prairie is shaded in gray. And they've had up to 80 to 90% habitat loss. So the remaining population is found in that red square that's outlined on the screen. And in addition to the habitat loss, where there is habitat that still occurs, it's very fire dependent ecosystem. So any sort of fire suppression also basically creates habitat that's not suitable for them. The decline it looks pretty steep. In 2018, the total estimated number of males across all 4 known populations was hovering around 50. And the population has a biased sex ratio, so there are more males than females. And that means that there is probably even less than that as far as breeding pairs were concerned. Some of the conservation actions that began prior to conservation breeding and release were demographic monitoring. So we put color bands on all of our birds, as well as the nestlings. And then you're able to track them and look at their behavioral observations and allow us to estimate survival rate, determine when birds are breeding and help us find their nest, and calculate recruitment rates for the population or how many of the birds survive and breed. There was also landscape scale research done looking at how to optimize burning regimes for the Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat. And they did this and found that although there's no effect on fire season or interval on nest survival rates, there is a nest site preference. They prefer current dormant and previous growing season burns. So this has helped us recommend which units to burn based on occupancy of the Florida grasshopper sparrows from the previous season to give them a better chance to find suitable habitat. We've also taken some very direct nest protection efforts from predators, and these are fences that are erected around the Florida grasshopper sparrow nests, and they keep out most of the mammals, or pretty much all of the mammals. Prior to fencing, mammals were responsible for more than half of the predation events, and then post fencing, we've seen very little to no mammals, but we still see snakes occasionally getting over the fences, and fire ants cannot be kept out by a mesh hardware. But the mammal reduction has been really great. And that has ended up creating a higher daily probability of survival, and also decreasing the probability of predation. And when we were formally looking at the numbers, comparing between fenced nests and unfenced nests. It seems like between 2015 and 2018, they estimated that an additional 115 fledglings were added to the population because of those fencing efforts on the nests. And now we go ahead and we put fences around all of the nests that we can find out there. Another protection that is done from flooding is the nests are actually lifted up. So when there's a heavy rain event, the nests get lifted up about a half a foot to a foot sometimes, depending on how saturated the ground is. And this allows for that nest to be successful when there is going to be heavy rain and flooding. So back to our sad graph here. The blue line is Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, and that property is directly managed by FWC. And like I said, in 2018, we only had about 30 breeding pairs, and that was even after the nest protection efforts had begun. So we knew that there was something more that was needed if we were going to stop an extinction event from happening and give us more time to figure out solutions for the bird. So that's where our conservation breeding and release program came in. It was a really difficult decision to make. When you have such low numbers, it can be really hard to decide what's best for the species. Is taking those reproductively capable adults and bringing them into captivity. Is that going to be a good choice, or are we just speeding up the process of extinction by doing that? We didn't know if they would breed in captivity. That was an unknown. We didn't know if they did breed and they were successful, what would be the most successful age class to release. Should we release them when they're independent from their parents? Or should we help them through that really challenging first winter of a sparrow's life and then release them the following season? We also didn't know if they needed to be acclimated. How long after living in captivity does a bird need to be on the landscape with supplemental food? That was unknown. And then the overall question is, would they even know how to sparrow? What if they survive, they make it, and then they just don't want to breed, or they don't know how to effectively raise their young? Because there were so many partners involved, we really needed a guiding document to help us figure out how we were going to answer these questions. So we created a 5-year strategic vision. It was primarily authored by Florida Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. However, there was input from the full Florida Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group at multiple points during the document. And partners agreed to adaptive management for releases. So we would be asking some of those tough questions as we went and change our release strategy when appropriate. The vision also outlined time-bound success criteria. We really wanted to be able to see if the captive breeding and release was actually working. And it was very helpful to talk about what we were going to do in different scenarios ahead of time before we actually had birds totally breeding and in the captive setting. We also talked about funding sources. We really didn't want to be in a scenario where we brought in birds and then found out we had no money to care for them for the next 5 years or more. And then within the vision, there was also 6 measurable objectives for the conservation goal. And that included habitat management, all of the nest protection efforts, monitoring, as well as captive management and release, and research and outreach. Those were our objectives. And our conservation goal is a little wordy, but I think the most important part of it is that we wanted to stabilize and grow the wild population while identifying management actions that can reverse the population decline. So the captive breeding and release is really just, we're trying to give us more time to identify what needs to be done management-wise in order to bring the sparrow back to sustainable population. The biggest question that the group had, and where there was a lot of disagreement, was what age class is best to release. So we had 2 cohorts that we released as juveniles and adults in 2019 and in 2020. And that gave us a large enough sample size to be able to look at analysis of how the juveniles versus the adults survived and recruited into the population. And it was pretty clear that adults did not do as well as the juveniles. The juveniles were much more likely to stay on the site and settle. And then they were also much more likely to be present on the site and breeding the following year. So, following our adaptive management strategy, we released only hatchier birds starting in 2021, after we were able to look at this data and really say confidently that juveniles were a better match for the program. So once again, this is just the numbers for our release rates for hatchier birds at 3 Lakes. And our settlement and recruitment is pretty good for our hatchier birds, and our second year birds had that lower end of settlement and recruitment. So our choice was to just do hatchiers moving forward. The other questions we had were about acclimation, as well as the aviary. How would they do in the aviary after being in captivity prior to being released? And it looked like the acclimation period didn't really matter. What they needed was a night to kind of rest and recuperate after travel, make sure they got a good breakfast, and then they were good to go, which was great news because we were able to also implement using a mobile aviary. So this is much less intensive. You're not keeping them as long, so you don't need to go in there and replenish the food and the water. They just kind of got in there, rested for the night, and then are released from the mobile aviary. So the release effort is pretty wonderful, and I think it's a great show of teamwork. We have to take this huge panel off of the aviary that's at 3 Lakes, and the birds are kind of like mice. They just kind of hop out. Occasionally they fly out, but usually it's pretty anticlimactic. So the releases are successful. Released birds are breeding. They're acting like sparrows. It's wonderful to see. And in 2023, the population at 3 Lakes had 31% of adults detected were released birds, and 54% of the breeding pairs have at least one released bird in that pairing. So they're out there, they're staying, and they are mingling with the wild birds and breeding successfully and raising young successfully out there, just like the wild birds. So to recap, in 2014, we started banding adults and nestlings in the population. And then in 2015, that was actually when they first started collecting birds for the captive flock that they were going to build. We didn't want to collect a bunch of birds at once, just because you don't want to take a lot of breeding pairs out of a population that's going down all at once. Then there were the first releases in 2019, and you can see how the numbers jumped up after that. Especially, and 3 Lakes was our only site where we were releasing birds, but in 2021 we added a second release site, and that's Avon Park, and you can see that their numbers have also gone up since receiving birds. Some other really exciting things that have happened in 2020, we found out that UF and Ducks Unlimited were able to purchase an easement on DeLuca, which has a population of birds that we were just saying were at the ranch, because we didn't want to name a private ranch, but it eventually got into an easement, which was excellent. And then shortly after that, in 2022, Corrigan Ranch was acquired and is managed by Kissimmee Prairie, which is also really excellent because they have a little pocket of sparrows too. So to look at this on a map, you can see here is DeLuca that was added to a conservation easement, and then Corrigan was also added in 2022. So it's been a really, really exciting to see those properties get added to the possibilities for the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow. And there is movement between the subpopulations. So even though most of the birds are released here at 3 Lakes, we have seen them move all around. And now we're also releasing a portion of birds at Avon Park. And these definitely are a little bit closer to Kissimmee Prairie and are able to go in between, even though there is a bit of a divide here with this waterway. We still see them moving back and forth. So, what are we doing in the meantime to try and figure out how to reverse the decline and stabilize the population? There's an ongoing study at Three Lakes and Kissimmee Prairie State Park looking at roller chopping effects to see if it decreases palmetto height and density. We know that the birds like a grassier, open area. And does it increase occupancy of the Florida grasshopper sparrow and decrease nest predation rates? And we're looking at vegetation surveys, Florida grasshopper sparrow surveys, and then we're also finding and monitoring nests, both Florida grasshopper sparrow and other species. It's really important because the intensive nest protection and the captive releases are short-term solutions that are incredibly labor intensive as well. So we know that landscape level solutions are the future for this bird, and as well as landscape level conservation, which we've already seen going on for the bird, which is really excellent movement in the right direction. The ground nesters that we're looking at in the roller chopped and treatment and control plots are other ground nesters, assuming that they have equal predation risk as the Florida grasshopper sparrow. We're still fencing and protecting every single Florida grasshopper sparrow nest that we find. So these other ground nesters are going to help us answer the question about predation. And the experiment has 6 units with the same fire history. So we know that they've been treated very similarly with past management. And then the treatment portions are roller chopped once, and that's this large mechanical treatment to try and break up some of that woody vegetation that doesn't go away after a burn. And then a unit is burned together post roller chop treatment. So fire is still an important part of the equation here. And what it looks like is you roughly have the side of the treatment is much grassier, and then the control side looks, generally speaking, a little bit more palmetto-y. And when we go out there and we look for nests, we have seen that the birds, all the ground nesters, Florida grasshopper sparrows included, do seem to be preferring the treatment areas. We've seen burrowing owls out there, and there's a ton of meadowlarks, common nighthawks, and then for Florida grasshopper sparrows, these blue dots are the females, and these colored areas are where the plots have been roller chopped. So these are our controls, and these are our treatments here. And something worthwhile to note is that prior to roller chopping, there hadn't been Florida grasshopper sparrows in these treatment areas for the past 5 years. So seeing several pop up post treatment was really exciting news. So we know that the birds like it, but the question is, does it help? And turn the volume down on that. So we are putting cameras on all of the nests to closely monitor them and see if the predation rates go down, or if the predators kind of change in the roller chopped areas versus the non-roller chopped areas. We are still in the middle of analyzing that data, so stay tuned for more on how much of a difference it makes for the nests in the roller chopped areas. So to summarize, we've observed over 50% increase in the population at the release site since the release started in 2019. And we, in addition to the releases, habitat management, population monitoring, and nest protection all play really important roles in the conservation and recovery of the species. Overall, the Florida grasshopper's population still remains pretty low, and therefore it's vulnerable to those stochastic events. So that's why we're protecting all of these nests from flooding. A normal healthy population should be able to lose a certain amount of nests from a flood, but with our numbers so low, we're still trying to baby them and take care of them until they get to a better spot. And our next steps are to continue roller chopping, and that 5-year strategic vision, which is our guiding principle document, actually is about to expire. And so we are in the midst of revising it and looking at the next 5 years and what the future is for the program, what our next goals should be. Because when made the first 5-year vision, we didn't know, there were so many unknowns about the captive breeding. And now we have a lot more answers to go into planning our next 5 years for the conservation and recovery of the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And I just have to say, it's a huge team effort. There are so many people that are out there sweating and looking for nests and lifting nests and protecting nests. And then there's also huge support from many other agencies and organizations, a lot of funding from Florida, from Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, and many others. So we are definitely the type of recovery program that is driven by a lot of partners and a lot of people. And with that, I can answer any questions if there are any.
So I have a question for you while we're waiting for any questions to pop up in the chat. Have they always been nesting in these areas? Because it seems like are these fires natural? Have they always adapted to nesting in these areas where natural fires would occur, or were they nesting somewhere else prior to that?
They were always nesting in a fire dependent ecosystem. So the Florida dry prairie requires fire in order to stay grassy. Without fire, it turns into a more of a woody type of vegetation regime. So they've always been in areas where there's fire, and there was a lot of fire in Florida. Lightning strikes and natural events were pretty common in causing those large fires.
So another question, what was the biggest challenge that you faced when you began captive breeding? So I know you mentioned that you had some worries, but what was that moment where you're like, oh no, like anything that really stood out to you that was a significant challenge during that process?
Yeah, so we have really great, really wonderful captive breeding facilities. White Oak is our largest captive breeding facility, and they were really excellent in creating these outdoor enclosures that and trying to keep the birds as wild as possible. Um, we did, I think, some of the things that we faced were there were some nutrition issues in the very beginning. We were seeing fault bars on the hatchier birds. Uh, it wasn't a deal breaker or anything, but we could tell that there was something going on in their development. And White Oak was able to add extra. I don't know exactly how they changed the diet of the bird, but they adjusted that to, and that seemed to take care of seeing those fault bars in the young birds. And then another thing that was a huge concern was the disease risk. So there was a lot of concern in the full working group that there might be um, some sort of novel disease that would be introduced by taking these birds into captivity, where they are, they're on the same property as a lot of exotic species, as other birds that are in captivity. So we had a disease risk assessment prior to setting up our captive facilities, and that was really helpful in sort of preemptively determining where everybody's comfort levels were, what the biggest concerns were, and all of the different ways they were going to mitigate that risk of spreading some sort of disease to the wild population, which would be, very much so the opposite of what we wanted to do if we somehow accidentally introduced birds that had a novel disease. So I think that was the biggest kind of theoretical concern that we've been very fortunate to not have to deal with in reality.
And I got another question. Will there ever be a time where you'll be able to remove those barriers between their nests and the other wildlife?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hopefully, yes. The We know that those really intensive micro habitat changes that we're making are not a sustainable way to move forward. Um, in the future, we want to be able to stop needing to put fences around the nests and stop lifting nests. Um, and hopefully, we'll be able to figure out what pieces of the puzzle are missing, in order to have the birds be able to have regular, have just that regular amount of nest failure, but it not create a huge crash in the population. That is the goal.
So will there also ever be a time that humans won't have to actually create the fires, where they might be able to naturally just these things might naturally occur and for the species to still thrive?
That's a really great question. No,
Oh,
the habitat is so different now. So um, there really isn't enough of the continuous prairie, or prior to the prairie there was a lot of longleaf pine. That ecosystem is also fire dependent and would allow fire to travel pretty quickly and naturally. But now that we have, subdivisions and concrete and a lot of breaking up of the ecosystem, just depending on lightning strikes is not going to be enough, because it would have to happen in such a very precise area, in order for it to work. And it would be likely that it wouldn't happen frequently enough, even if they did try and rely on wildfires happening naturally, which they still do happen occasionally. At Three Lakes, a lightning strike will set a fire, but habitats like this are just completely dependent on that fire return interval being put on the ground by habitat managers.
are there any other questions from the audience? If you have a question, you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself, put them in the chat. All right. So thank you very much for joining us today, Adrienne. It was a pleasure hearing you speak about all the work that you've done, this vital work for the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, and for all of that you taught us about the future of this project as well. We hope to hear updates from you about the success of this project, of course. Um, so thank you to everyone who joined us today for this Wild Lecture series. We will be replaying this on YouTube. So if you missed part of the lecture and you want to see it in the future, you can always watch it on our YouTube channel. We also have links to it on our social media. So please, if you aren't following our social media, please give us a like or a follow. You'll get to see the link for this as well as upcoming Wild Lecture series. And just once again, thank you so much, Adrienne, for your time today, for presenting such amazing work, and thank you everyone who joined. So,
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow. So it's always nice to get the word out.
all right. Bye. Have a great day.
Bye.